I am not here to be saved." I had not expected her to look at me that way. Most people who arrived at Varenthal Hold came with their eyes cast carefully down, reading the stone floor, the worn runner of charcoal wool, the scuff marks left by 100 boots that had crossed my threshold with varying degrees of apprehension. Treaty guests, tribute emissaries, petitioners, the occasional merchant who had wandered farther north than was wise. They all found the same spot on the floor somewhere between the outer doors and my chair, and they kept their gaze there until I gave them permission to raise it. Saren of the Arenthas did not look at the floor. She looked at me. Straight across the length of my great hall, through the fire smoke and the low amber of the braziers, from the moment the outer doors opened to admit the cold in her and her single trunk, which 2 of my men carried between them with visible strain. She looked at me the way a person looks at a country they have arrived in and are already forming opinions about. Not hostile, not fearful, assessing, in a way that was unhurried and entirely calm, as though she had all the time she needed and expected to use it wisely. I sat in my chair at the far end of the hall and felt, for reasons I could not immediately account for, that I had been found slightly wanting. I was Aldrich of Varenthal, Alpha of the Northern Hold, feared across 4 pack territories for a steadiness that most people read as coldness, and that I had long since stopped correcting them on. I was 37 years old. I had not taken a mate. I had, and this was the part my counsel never quite said aloud but always meant when they looked at me with that particular shade of careful worry, I had not been able to take a mate. My wolf had gone still 9 years ago, after the bond I thought I'd found turned out to be neither mutual nor real, only an enchantment laid by a woman of ambition who had used a borrowed working to mimic the mate pull, and then vanished when the ruse was discovered. My wolf had not recovered. He sat somewhere inside me like a fire that had burned down to coals, present, warm enough to sustain life, but no longer capable of anything larger than that. I had accepted it. I had built a hold and held a territory and kept my people safe, and I had decided that a man could do good work in the world without the particular good of a fated bond, and most days I believed it. Saren of the Arenthas walked into my hall on a Tuesday in the deep of winter, and looked at me as if she were reading the topography of a landscape she intended to understand, and my wolf, 9 years asleep, moved. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not a surge or a howl or any of the fire in the blood descriptions I had read in the old chronicles of first bondings. It was subtler than that and more alarming for being subtle. It was the sensation of something that has been very still for a very long time becoming slightly less still, like a window coming open in a room that has been shut a long season, like the weight behind my sternum shifting by a fraction of an inch. I kept my face composed. I was good at that. She reached the foot of the 3 steps that led to the chair, and she stopped at a respectful distance, and she said, "Aldrich of Varenthal, I am Saren of the Arenthas. I am told we have a treaty that requires my presence here for 3 months." She paused. "I have brought my own reading material. I will not be a burden." My second, Orith, who was standing to my left and who had served me for 11 years and knew every inflection of my silence, made a sound that was almost entirely not a laugh. "You are welcome at Varenthal," I said. I said it the way I said most things, level, with enough weight behind it that it could not be dismissed, and with nothing in it that asked for anything back. "You will have a room in the east wing. My housekeeper, Marit, will show you to it. Supper is at the 7th bell." "Thank you," she said. She said it like a person who means thanks as information rather than supplication. And then she turned, without waiting to be dismissed, which was a thing that almost no one did, and followed Marit toward the east corridor, and her trunk bumped along behind her in the hands of my 2 men, and the outer doors closed against the winter, and the hall settled back into its ordinary smoke and amber. Orith waited until she was certainly out of hearing before he said quietly, "She's not what I expected." "No," I agreed. "What did you expect?" I didn't answer him. I was thinking about the thing that had moved inside me, the window that had come open by that fraction, and I was trying to decide whether it was real or whether it was only the cold air she'd brought in from outside, finding the gaps in me that winter always found. The Arenthas were an old bloodline. They had held 3 river territories to the southwest, once good land, well-positioned, with enough wolf stock and pack history to have been a significant name in the Northern Alliance. They were not a significant name now. A decade of bad governance, a disputed succession, a pack split that had never healed, and finally a territorial loss to the Venmore coalition had reduced what had been a proud house to a remnant of 18 souls on borrowed land with no alpha and no clear future. The treaty that had sent Saren to me was an old border compact, invoked by the Arenthas remnant as a last piece of legal standing. It entitled them to a guest right at Varenthal for 1 winter in times of need, in exchange for an old service rendered by their bloodline to mine 2 generations back. My council had debated it. Some of them had argued that the compact was outdated, that the Arenthas were too reduced to be worth the courtesy. I had overruled them, not because I had strong feelings about the Arenthas specifically, but because I held that a word given, even one given by my grandfather, was a word kept. Varenthal had a reputation for its word. I intended to maintain that reputation. So she came, and I had expected, I realized in the days that followed, someone who was defeated, someone carrying the weight of a ruined house in their posture, in the downward pull of their shoulders, in the particular exhaustion of a person who has been responsible for something that failed. I had expected gratitude of the anxious kind, the kind that comes from knowing one's position and being afraid of it. Saren was not carrying anything in her posture except herself. She came to supper the first evening in a dress of dark green wool that was well made and very clean and not new, the kind of garment that has been cared for across many years. She sat where Marit placed her, which was at the middle of the long table rather than at the foot where treaty guests were sometimes put as a signal of relative standing, because Marit had her own sense of things and had evidently decided that the foot of the table was not where this one belonged. She spoke when spoken to and initiated conversation twice, once to ask Orith about the pack territories to the north of Varenthal, a question that showed she'd been looking at maps, and once to ask the woman beside her, my records keeper Dantha, whether Varenthal held the old Arenthas trading records from 60 years back or whether those had gone elsewhere when the compact was originally drawn. Dantha had blinked at her with the expression of a person who is trying to determine whether they are being tested. "We may have them in the lower archive," she'd said. "I'd like to look through them, if it's permitted," Saren had said. "There are questions about the original compact terms that I think the records would clarify. I'd rather understand what I'm operating under." She said it pleasantly, without apology, as if reading archive records were the most natural use of a winter guest's time. Dantha had looked at me from across the table. I had given her the small nod that meant yes, let her. After supper I walked the wolf yard, as I always did in the evening, because the wolves had needed me less since my own wolf went quiet, but they were still my pack's wolves, and the walking was part of how I maintained a relationship with the hold that was not purely administrative. There were 11 wolves in the yard. They knew me. They came to my hand the way they always had, which was with affection but without the particular pull that wolves show toward a person whose bond is live and singing, that full-body orientation, the way they hold still as if the world has stopped. They came to me as something familiar and valued. That was enough. I was at the far end of the yard when I heard a sound from the east wing doorway, which opened onto the yard from the corner. I looked up. Saren was standing in the doorway. She was not trying to enter the yard. She had simply opened the door, I thought, meaning to look at something, or perhaps to take air, and found the yard there. She was watching the wolves. The wolves were watching her. 11 pairs of eyes had gone to her in that way. I had not seen them go to anyone in some time, Not the friendly, familiar orientation they gave me, but the full stillness, the listening. One of them, Bran, the oldest, who had been with the hold for 8 years, and who was not given to overtures, walked to the doorway and pushed his nose against her hand. Saren did not pull back. She let him. She looked down at him with an expression that was softer than anything I had seen on her face at supper, not her public composure but something underneath it, something that was real and that she hadn't known I was there to observe. Then she looked up and saw me. The soft thing didn't vanish exactly. It settled back, the way a fire adjusts when the door is opened and the air shifts. She said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb the yard." "You haven't," I said. Bran was still pressing his nose against her hand. She scratched behind his ear once, with a naturalness that said she had been around wolves before and was not performing for them. He leaned into it. "He's older," she said. 8 years. He has good manners." I looked at Bran, who was making an embarrassing amount of himself against her hand. "Usually," I said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. "Good night, Aldrich of Varenthal," she said. "Good night," I said. She went inside. Bran stood at the doorway for a moment after she left, looking at the space where she'd been. Then he turned and walked back into the yard and sat down near the water trough and looked at nothing, the way old wolves do when they are thinking things over. My wolf stirred again, the window further open. I stood in the cold for a while longer than I needed to. The second day she went to the archive. Dantha reported to me at midday that the Arentha's treaty guest had spent 3 hours in the lower archive with the trading records, and had found 2 amendments to the original compact that had apparently been added in the second generation, and that no one, not the Arentha's remnant, not my council, had known existed. One of the amendments extended the guest right to a full winter, rather than the 3 months both sides had been operating under. The other established a reciprocal obligation on Varenthal's part that my grandfather had agreed to, and that had never been called in, and that was, Dantha admitted with the expression of a person delivering unexpected news, actually quite significant. I went to the archive myself that afternoon. She was still there. She'd moved to a second set of records by then, and had a system of small marker strips that she was using to flag pages, which she had apparently made herself from strips of the paper she'd brought with her in her trunk. The archive table was organized in a way it had not been when I'd last seen it, not reorganized precisely, but arranged so that the documents she was cross-referencing were accessible to each other, which was a practical reading habit, and not one most people applied to old treaty records. "You found the amendments," I said. She looked up. Yes. She didn't apologize for finding them. She said, "Your grandfather was a careful man. He wrote them in a cleaner hand than the original compact, probably because he cared more about the additions than the baseline terms." "The Second Amendment," I said. "The reciprocal obligation." She folded her hands on the table calmly. "I'm not going to invoke it. I want you to know that. I didn't come here to find leverage. I came because the compact entitled my people to a winter's standing, and that standing matters to them even if it doesn't change what happens in the spring. But I thought you should know the amendment exists, because it belongs to the record." I looked at her for a moment. "Most people," I said, "who discovered a provision that favored their position would not volunteer that they had no intention of using it. Most people," she said, "are operating from a position where they feel they need everything they can get." She said it without self-pity, which was the most remarkable part, just the flat fact of a thing observed. I'm not in that position. I know what I have and what I don't. What I have is the compact, this winter, and 18 people who needed to know there was still somewhere that would receive them when they needed it. That is enough. "Is it?" I said. I didn't mean it as a challenge. I meant it as an honest question, and something in my voice must have communicated that, because she considered it seriously before she answered. For now, she said, for this winter, the spring will be its own question. What happens to you in the spring? That depends on what can be built between now and then. She looked back at the records, which is why I'm reading. I'd rather know what I'm actually working with. I stayed in the archive longer than I'd intended. We talked about the trading routes that the original compact had been designed to protect. 3 of them no longer existed, and 2 of them did, in different forms, and about what the Arentha's remnant actually needed versus what the treaty technically provided. And she was precise and unsentimental and clear-eyed in a way that I found myself responding to without meaning to. She knew what she didn't know. She said so directly, without the hedging that most people used to avoid admitting ignorance. She asked questions that were good questions. When the bell rang for the 5th hour, she gathered her marker strips neatly and stacked the records she'd been using back in their original positions, not perfectly, but in the spirit of the organization they'd had, and she said, "Thank you for talking through it with me." "It was useful," I said, and then, because it was true, "Come to the archive again tomorrow if you want to continue." She nodded once like a person accepting a workable arrangement, not grateful, not effusive, simply present with the agreement of it. "Good night," she said, and left. My wolf was not asleep that evening. The second night I could not account for myself. I walked the hold longer than usual. I went twice to the wolf yard and found it quiet and ordinary, Bran asleep near the wall with his chin on his paws, which was his typical posture and not the listening stillness he'd shown at the east wing door. I told myself this was nothing. I had been alone a long time, and I was unused to having a person in the hold who spoke to me as if I were a person worth speaking to rather than a power worth managing, and that was all this was. The archive conversation, the directness, the good questions. My wolf pressed forward against whatever I used to hold him back, gently and insistently, like a dog at a door. I went to sleep eventually. I dreamed, which I did not usually do or did not usually remember. I did not remember what the dream was, only that when I woke the window feeling was back and it was stronger than before, and I lay in the dark of my chamber and listened to the wind off the pines and thought, I am in trouble of a kind I do not fully recognize yet. The 3rd day she was in the yard when I came out in the morning. Not in the wolf yard, in the main courtyard, where the supply carts came in and where my pack members crossed when moving between the hall and the outer buildings. She was standing near the well with a cup of something hot and watching the morning come up over the eastern ridge, which was a particular thing to watch at Varenthal, because the ridge was steep and dark with pine. And when the light came, it came over the top in a narrow band that lit the yard in gold for approximately 12 minutes before the angle changed, and the light went broad and ordinary. Most people who lived at Varenthal did not stop to look at it because it happened every morning, and familiarity is the enemy of attention. She was looking at it. I crossed the yard toward the hall and she said, without turning her head, "Is it always like that?" "Every clear morning," I said. "How long have you lived here?" 22 years. "And you still look at it?" It was not a question. I stopped beside her at a reasonable distance and looked at the ridge. "When I remember to," I said. We stood there in the cold for a few minutes and watched the 12 minutes happen. The light went through its band of gold and broadened out, and the yard settled into its ordinary morning. "Your wolves are very fine," she said. "The older one, Bran, he came to the courtyard door this morning when I was getting water. I don't think he was supposed to be out of the yard." "He has opinions about where he's supposed to be," I said. "They're not always aligned with mine." "He sat with me for a while." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I used to have wolves, my family's. Before the territory went." "What happened to them?" "They're with the remnant, some of them. The others," she stopped just for a breath. "Then, the others went with the land, that's how it works." "Yes," I said, because it was, and because she knew it and hadn't tried to make it softer than it was, and the only honest response to that was acknowledgement. She nodded once and drank from her cup, and we stood in the ordinary morning light and didn't speak for a while, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply the quiet of two people who had decided, without deciding it, that there was no particular need to fill time with words. My wolf was not being still at all. The third evening, supper was louder than usual. Orith had received word of good news from the Eastern Patrol. A pack of strays that had been troubling the outer territories had moved on without engagement, which was the best possible outcome and one nobody had quite expected, and the mood in the hall was easier. People were talking at full volume. Someone had brought out a stringed instrument from somewhere and was playing it badly but enthusiastically at the far end of the table, and Merritt had produced a second course that no one had asked for but everyone received with appreciation. Saren was in her usual seat. She was talking to Orith about the Eastern Territories with an interest that was clearly genuine. She asked where the pack of strays had last been documented, and whether they'd crossed into the river valley before moving off. And Orith, who did not talk easily with strangers as a rule, was answering her with actual information rather than the polished-down version he gave to most visitors. My counsel was at the head of the table with me. There were 4 of them, my eldest advisor Harl, my wardens Peth and Colin, and my treaty keeper Bronn, and they were watching her with the specific kind of attention that means they are forming a considered opinion and haven't decided whether to share it yet. Harl said, quietly enough that only those at the head of the table would hear, "She's not what the Arentha's name suggests." "No," I said. "She found the amendments. She told me about them immediately." Harl considered this. He was 71 years old and had served Varenthal under my father and then under me, and had seen most of what one could see in the way of people managing difficult positions. "Straight dealing," he said, "from a position that didn't require it." "Yes," Bronn, my treaty keeper, said without looking up from her food. "The Second Amendment's reciprocal obligation is not small. She could have held it until the spring, and used it to secure the remnant's position in the territorial negotiations. She said she has no intention of invoking it." "People change their minds." "Some people do," I said. Bronn looked at me then, with the particular look of a person who has known someone long enough to read things they haven't said. She didn't say anything else. Supper went on. The bad musician improved marginally, or perhaps we all simply adjusted. The hall was warm and the news was good, and my hold felt, this evening, like a place where things were well. I watched Saren laugh at something Orith said, a real laugh, not the polished social approximation, and I noted to myself alone that it was the first time I had seen her laugh, and that it was a good thing to have seen. The hall was still half full when the doors to the wolf yard opened. They opened from the inside, which meant a wolf had opened them, which was a thing that was possible at Varenthal because the wolf yard doors had a lever rather than a latch, a design that had seemed practical once and that I had occasionally regretted. They opened, and Bran walked through them, across the length of the hall, past 20-odd people who went quiet in the particular way that a held breath is quiet, past the tables and the fire pits and the badly played instrument, and he walked to where Saren was sitting, and he lay down at her feet. The hall was entirely silent. Bran put his chin on his paws and closed his eyes with the expression of a wolf who has completed a task and is satisfied with it. And then, and this was what the silence in the hall was actually for, though none of them quite understood it yet, my wolf rose. Not like a fire going out, as he had been for 9 years. Not like the small movements of the past 3 days. He rose the way a tide comes in, not a wave but a shift, a fundamental change in the level of everything, a warmth that began behind my sternum and spread outward through my ribs and into my hands, and I looked down at my wrists, and the mate mark was there. Both wrists. The pattern of a bond 9 years delayed, burning in light the color of amber against my skin. Orith to my left said, "Aldrich." I was already looking at her. She was looking at her own wrists. The mark was on her too, symmetrical, the same amber light pattern, exactly as the old texts described a true fated bond, both parties, both marks, simultaneously unmistakable. The hall was so quiet that I could hear the fire. Bran, at her feet, did not move. He was already where he meant to be. Saren looked up from her wrists and looked at me. Across the length of the table, across the silence of 20 people who had gone still, she looked at me. Her face was not afraid, not swept away. She was reading the landscape again, but this time the landscape was something that had just changed under her feet, and she was taking her time with it, the way she took her time with everything. She said in a voice that carried in the silence without being raised, "I told you, I am not here to be saved." I stood up from the chair at the head of the table. The hall watched. I walked the length of it, past my counsel, past the fires, past the instrument player who had his hands frozen over the strings, past all 20 of my people who were watching something they had waited, some of them, years to see, and I stopped in front of her table. Not close enough to crowd her. Far enough that the space between us was still a choice she could make. I said, "I know." She watched me. "I'm not offering to save you," I said. "You don't need it. You came here with one trunk and the full weight of yourself, and you've been reading my archive and managing my wolves for 3 days, and the bond is on both our wrists, and my wolf lay down for the first time in 9 years, and none of that is about saving." I stopped. The thing inside my chest was so completely alive now that I had to be careful with my voice. "I am asking you to choose, not because the mark demands it, not because you have anywhere else to be, because you have shown me in 3 days what it means for a person to be exactly what they are, without apology or performance, and I stopped again. I would like to know you, for as long as you'll have me know you." The hall was not breathing. Saren looked at me for a long moment, down at the mark on her wrists, at Bran, who had opened one eye and was looking up at her with the mild expression of an old wolf who considers his work done, back at me. "You'll find," she said slowly, "that I have strong opinions about archive organization." "I've noticed," I said, "and I will continue to read my own material. I have 2 more trunks still at the Remnants Holdings that someone will need to fetch. I'll send for them. I don't like ceremony." "Neither do I." She was quiet. The mark was still glowing. Bran's chin was still on his paws. "You have a very good ridge," she said. "The morning light." "Yes. I'd like to see it more than one winter." My wolf was so alive in my chest that I did not entirely trust myself to speak at full volume. "Then stay," I said quietly, just for her, though the hall heard it anyway. "Not because the bond demands it, because I am asking and because you decide." Saren was still for one more moment. Then she placed her marked wrist on the table and turned her palm upward, which was the old gesture, older than words, older than ceremony, the mate bond acknowledgement that had come down through so many generations that no one remembered inventing it, only that it meant, "I see this. I choose it. Not swept away. Not swept up. Chosen with eyes open by a person who knew exactly what she was doing." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. The mark went warm, sealed, not bright anymore, not the flaring amber of first recognition, but the deeper, quieter glow of something that has found its place and settled in. Harl said from the head of the table, in the voice of a man who is trying very hard to sound calm, "Well." Orith was not attempting to hide anything. He was simply looking at me with an expression that was relief and warmth, and something very close to the emotion that had no proper name. The one that comes when a thing you had quietly, privately given up on turns out to have been happening all along, somewhere you couldn't see. Bran, my treaty keeper who missed nothing, looked from the mark on my wrists to the mark on Saren's, and she said, very quietly to the person beside her, The reciprocal obligation in the Second Amendment was a guest right, not a mating compact, but I think the outcome is the same. Nobody laughed, but several people came very close. I should tell you the spring. I have been telling this story in the way I experienced it, which is fast and interior and not always arranged by the clock, and so the spring deserves its own accounting, briefly. The 18 people of the Arenthas remnant came to Varenthal at the end of winter, as the thaw began, because Saren had sent for them. Not as refugees and not as treaty guests, and not in any of the careful, provisional arrangements that border compacts had been designed to accommodate for centuries. She had sent for them as family. And they came the way family comes when it has been a long and difficult season, and someone they trust has told them there is somewhere to be. My counsel had opinions about this. Several of the opinions were delivered directly to me by people who had my respect and who were doing their jobs in expressing concern. I heard all of them. Then Saren sat in the council chamber, not because I had asked her to, but because I had offered her the chair to my left and she had decided that taking it was a reasonable thing, and she spoke to my counsel for 40 minutes about the Arenthas people, their skills, their pack history, what they had been before the collapse and what remained of it, the wolves they'd brought, the bloodlines, the specific knowledge of the river territories that nobody in Varenthal had because nobody in Varenthal had ever needed it before, and why that knowledge was now, given the changes in the Eastern Coalition, actually worth having. She did not ask for charity. She proposed a merger. Harl looked at her for a long while when she was done. He was 71 years old and had seen most of what one could see. He said, "You drew this up before you came." "I drew the first draft before I came," she said. "I've been revising it since I read the archive." Harl looked at me. "She's right about the river territories," I said. "She's right about most of it," Harl said, as if this were a mild inconvenience. Then to Saren, "The eastern wolf stock you mentioned, the breeding lines, those can be documented." "3 generations back," she said, "I have the records." "In your trunk." "In the 2 trunks my mates hold sent for in the winter," she said. The word mate sat in the room without announcement, simply and completely, the way she said most things. Harl made a sound that was, from him, as close to delight as I had heard in years. He picked up his pen. "The mark doesn't announce itself to the world the way the old stories suggest. No coronation, no grand ceremony, no day when the whole assembles to witness a naming. That is the story version. The real version is quieter and more pervasive. It is the mark that is there every morning when you wake and every evening when you close the archive. It is the wolf that has been fully alive in your chest for 3 months, and that you can now no longer imagine having been without. It is Bran walking between you in the corridor because he has decided that this is his appropriate position in the new geography of things. It is the 12 minutes of morning light, watch from the courtyard, becoming something you do together. It is Saren at the council table, with her marker strips and her good questions and the absolute refusal to be less than exactly what she is, and my council, all 4 of them including Bronn, who changes her positions on nothing quickly, trusting her within the first 3 months, in the way you trust a person who has shown you, repeatedly and without performance, that they say what they mean. It is the Arenthas wolves in the yard with my Varenthal wolves, which had required some negotiation among the wolves themselves, but had been resolved in the way wolf matters usually resolve when nobody interferes too much. By the wolves deciding, in their own time and on their own terms, what the new arrangement was. It is the evening she found the 3rd Amendment. There was a 3rd Amendment. No one had known. She found it in the 4th week of spring, in a set of records that had been catalogued under the wrong year, and she came to me in the evening with the look on her face that I had learned to recognize as the expression she wore when she had found something that required reframing of everything around it, and she said, "Aldrich, the 3rd Amendment. What does it say?" It says that in the event of a mated bond arising between the Varanthal Alpha and a person of the Arenthas bloodline, the two packs are considered merged by blood right as of the bonding date, and all territorial questions are resolved by the merger provisions in the Varanthal Charter. She looked at me. Your grandfather knew. He wrote this in 20 years before we were born. I was quiet for a moment, thinking about a man I had known only in the last years of his life, and what he might have known about destiny that he had thought it worth encoding in archive records 2 generations early. He was a careful man, I said, her own words from the first day in the archive. Very, she said. She was looking at the document, then at me. The mark on her wrists was its deep, settled amber, the color it had been since the evening in the hall, the same that mine was. He built it in, she said, not quite a question. He built it in, I agreed. She was quiet. I watched her process this, the discovery that something as large as the rest of her life had been, in some sense, written forward by people who had not even met her yet, and that the writing had not diminished her arrival at it in any way, had not taken any single choice from her. She had still arrived. She had still decided. The document only confirmed what the mark already knew. I don't like the idea that things were arranged for me, she said, in the careful voice she used when she was thinking aloud. No, I said. But I also, she stopped, started again. I chose, you know that, I chose it in the hall knowing what I was choosing. The document doesn't change that. No, I said, it doesn't. She nodded, folded the document carefully with her marker strips and set it with the relevant records. Then she looked up at me and said, in the voice that was neither her archive voice nor her council voice, but the one that was only for the spaces between them, the evening voice, the courtyard voice, the 12 minutes of morning light voice. He had good instincts, your grandfather. So I've been told. She was, very slightly, smiling. I'm going to reorganize the archive's year catalog. The misfilling system is going to cause problems. I know. I'll need at least a week. You'll have it. She picked up her marker strips and went to the archive. I stood in the corridor for a moment in the evening quiet of Varanthal Hold, with my wolf warm in my chest and the mark on my wrists and Bran leaning against my leg, with the settled satisfaction of an old wolf who has known something, it seems, for longer than any of us had realized. I thought about my grandfather writing a treaty amendment in careful handwriting 20 years before I was born, in a room in this same hold, for a future he could not have seen clearly but had written toward anyway. I thought about a woman arriving in winter with one trunk and no apology, looking straight at me from across my great hall, and my wolf, 9 years asleep, coming awake for the first time. I thought about 12 minutes of morning light, and the certainty that I had not, after all, given anything up, only waited, without knowing I was waiting, for the person who would arrive in their own time and their own terms and refuse to be anything less than completely themselves. That, it turns out, was enough, more than enough, the whole of it. She reorganized the archive in 5 days, not 7, because she had been thinking about the system while she was doing other things, and arrived at the solution on the 4th morning, while we were watching the light come over the ridge. Chronological primary, subject secondary, she said, with the satisfaction of a problem resolved. The misfilling happened because someone used subject as the primary, and then couldn't agree on what subjects meant across generations. That makes sense, I said. I'll have it done by the 5th bell. I'll have supper held until the 6th, I said. She looked at me briefly, with the expression that had no formal name but that I had come to know as the one that meant she was pleased, and was not going to make a large thing of it. Good, she said. The light did what it always did, came over the ridge in its narrow band of gold, lit the yard for 12 minutes and widened into morning. We watched it together. We watched it every morning after that, for a very long time.